Joshua Perry from the Big Ten Network joins us. Craig Smoke and Paul Catalina, David Smoke, 365 Sports, and very happy Big Ten and Ohio State Buckeye. Joshua, thank you very much for your time. Big Ten now has won back-to-back national championships with Michigan and the Buckeyes. Are they now, in your opinion, because of that and because of the money and everything else, do they look directly eye to eye to the SEC and maybe even right now better?
Just means more, right? That's what they say down south, at least. Listen, I'm not ready to say that the Big Ten has surpassed the SEC in terms of the football. I think if you look at the depth of the Southeastern Conference on a year-to-year basis, you have multiple teams that are legitimate contenders, and those conference schedules are no joke. Whereas you look in the Big Ten, of course, you got Ohio State and Michigan, Oregon, Penn State. You add in a couple other teams maybe on a year-to-year basis, but outside of that, if you get a Purdue on your schedule, you're feeling pretty good about that one. You get a UCLA on your schedule, you're feeling pretty good about that one. Northwestern, you're feeling pretty good. So I would say that if you're looking at, total top to bottom strength of the conference, SEC probably gets the edge there, but it's hard to deny that the Big Ten has put itself right in the spot where when you mention the SEC, you have to mention the Big Ten, in particular the contenders that are coming out of that conference right now.
Is it important for teams like Nebraska, Illinois to maybe break through, to have another type Indiana team, whether it's Indiana again, but maybe add a couple more of those so that, you do have Penn State, Oregon, Michigan, all that there, but some of those teams also need to break through so you don't kind of suffer the top heavy fate of, say, an ACC?
Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned Nebraska. I think it's important for them because they're a team that would be taken seriously in terms of how the media covers them, in terms of what their history is, how people will talk about them. I feel the same way about Wisconsin right now under Luke Fickell, and it feels like it's going to be another tough year for them, but they need to get back to being a team that's winning 10 games a year. You mentioned Illinois, and it feels like they're kind of next up, kind of what Indiana did last year is what people anticipate that they'll do this year. But the hard part about it is when people talk about Illinois nationally, it just doesn't hit the same as when you're talking about Nebraska or Wisconsin. So I feel like part of it truly is some of those teams, need to consistently carry their way through the conference. But the other part is when you have some of these big brands that have kind of been dormant in terms of chasing titles, you throw UCLA now that they're a Big Ten member in that conversation, even USC to a degree where I think people expect a lot of them and people want them to be good, but the last couple of years hasn't gone that way for them. I think if some of those brands start playing consistently better football, now all of a sudden you look at the conference and when their biggest brands align with some of the best teams, now it feels like it's a really top to bottom conference.
Josh, up until last year, if we had been interviewing you for like a decade, I don't know, we could probably count on one hand the amount of times we'd have asked you about Indiana football. And now, off of last year, we have to, right? The bar set so high. What do you think about the Hoosiers in year two with Cignetti coming off that playoff appearance?
Well, I think Curt Cignetti is a hell of a football coach, and I'll start there. And I think he's actually got a really good staff, too. His defensive coordinator, Brian Haynes, was actually a guy who was on staff at Ohio State as a graduate assistant when I was a player. And so I've watched his career, and he kind of rose up with Cignetti. They met up at JMU or one of the stops maybe before that, but he was there at JMU. And then last year was the architect of a top 10 defense for Indiana. Fernando Mendoza is the transfer portal quarterback that they got. I think he's a really good player. I think that he's the type of guy who not only will be productive for Indiana, but also will be looked at as a legitimate NFL prospect. So they're good there. Wide receivers, I think they're going to be a solid group as well. And maybe not super top flight, but just as a whole, I think that group's going to be productive. But then you start to ask the question about the trenches and can they really hold up to what some of the top teams are able to do year in and year out, which is have really good trench play. And that's probably the hardest part of your team to develop. I know on the defensive line, they might not be as good as they were last year. Lots of guys who draft picks certainly have one of the top edge rushers in the Big Ten coming back, Mikael Kamara, but do they have enough as a whole in that group? Is their linebacker group going to be the same? I think depth is going to be an issue back there. And then I look at their secondary. D'Angelo Pons is a quarterback for them. People should know his name nationally. I think he's going to be a great player. But outside of that, you're asking the question. So this is Kurt Cignetti now kind of having to reload. He was able to bring his guys over from JMU. He was able to develop some of what was already at Indiana. But now it's like, okay, can you repeat that? And it's not going to be necessarily him or how he coaches, but from a personnel standpoint, can you convince good enough players that Indiana's a place where they can come, have success, and then go off and play in the NFL?
So with the way the Big Ten is, the scheduling's an algorithm, right? They throw this thing into some kind of machine and spit it out. Do you feel like that you would ever see Ohio State in the same season, or Michigan or Penn State play all of the alphas in one year? And maybe if that was to happen, it would happen to like Northwestern and somebody else, or is that just being too much a conspiracy theorist?
No, I feel like, they put parameters on the algorithm when they plug the things in there. I don't think that they would necessarily want to do that. And certainly if they did, these schools have complained to the conference office before. But to your point, I do think we see the schedules where some of the teams who maybe aren't like the top in the conference end up having to play a lot of those great teams. I mentioned Wisconsin, and part of this when you talk about the algorithm is they've done it based off of historical success is a part of how they get to the schedule. So you look at Wisconsin, and they've got to play Ohio State, they've got to play Oregon. I believe that they've got to play Michigan as well this year, and then Iowa's always going to be on their schedule with rivalries and whatnot. And that seems like a really difficult schedule to have to play for any team in the conference. So it's interesting to your point. I don't think we'd ever get to a spot where we're looking at Ohio State and it's like, okay, well, they've got Penn State and they've got Michigan, which they did last year. But moving forward, I don't think that's going to happen. But you get a Wisconsin that gets it, and that's a tough spot because you're looking at Wisconsin did in the years before Luke Fickell, and maybe you felt like the numbers historically support what goes into the algorithm. But there's got to be a better way to focus in right now and get more balanced schedules that way. I look at the SEC, and I think they've got a scheduling issue too. The way that they do it, where they just kind of flip-flop the home and away games the next year. They had some really unbalanced schedules last year, and I think just overall in college football, there should be a way to look at this thing much closer and say, all right, now that we've gotten it, we've got the data, we know what the teams are going to look like, let's try to find a way to make these conference schedules as balanced as possible. It gives your teams the best chance to make it into the postseason when you do that.
How quickly do we see Bryce Underwood at Michigan?
It's a funny question that you ask because I talked to Jake Butt, who was an All-American tight end there at the University of Michigan earlier today, and I asked him, what do you think? And Michigan brought in Mikey Keene, who was the quarterback at Fresno State, through the transfer portal. And I think part of the reason they brought him in was to give Bryce Underwood a little bit of breathing room. Mikey Keene gets the injury in spring. Bryce Underwood's able to develop a little bit more, maybe close the gap in that way. Early part of the season, I'm not sure. And Oklahoma might be the one where maybe you see a package or two to throw him out there and see what he can do. But it feels like probably 4, 5, 6 games in, they're going to turn the keys over to him. And part of the reason why is I think as long as he doesn't hold the team back, they want to make sure that they can get an athlete that has his skill set, which Michigan has never seen before at the quarterback position. And that's not a knock on anybody, including J.J. McCarthy, who's phenomenal. But Bryce Underwood is kind of a one-of-one for what they've had at quarterback. I think they want to get him the reps as early as possible. So 2-3 years from now, that guy is in the Heisman conversation.
Joshua, you've seen Penn State get a lot of preseason hype in years past, but it just feels like off the heels of last year with what they have returning, especially that backfield, obviously, there's a lot of excitement. I mean, they're legit, obviously, but how good do you think Penn State is potentially, and what is the key to unlocking their maximum potential in your opinion?
Well, there's a couple of things here. So there's the roster conversation, and their roster is in as good of a spot as it's been in a very long time. And they've kind of followed the mold from that standpoint of the last two national champions, where Michigan was very veteran when they won. And Ohio State last year had a lot of veteran players when they won it. So Penn State returns a quarterback, which a lot of teams in the Big Ten and nationally aren't returning a quarterback. They've got a two-headed monster running back. They've got a defensive line that is going to be stout. They've got a linebacker room that's going to be really good. People are in love with that secondary. The biggest question to me, roster-wise, is the wide receiver room. And I felt like Drew Aller, the quarterback, was not helped out in a lot of scenarios a year ago with who he was throwing the football to. Those guys just weren't difference makers. So if the wide receivers can play well, I think they've got as good of a shot as anybody to win the title this year. Then there's the James Franklin conversation. And I feel like we should have learned a lesson from what we've seen over the last 5 or so years in college football with Kirby Smart. Couldn't beat Alabama, couldn't get over the hump. Maybe he was never going to win national title, and he did. Jim Harbaugh, couldn't beat Ohio State. He was going to die trying, and they couldn't win Big Ten titles, whatever the case was. Made it to the playoffs 3 years in a row and won it a couple years ago. And then Ohio State, where Ryan Day, big games, he wins all the ones he's supposed to win, but he can't win the big game. Now he's got the Michigan issue, and then he ends up winning the title. And so maybe we're looking at James Franklin where, big game James, and this guy can't win the big game. I don't know. Maybe he's got the roster this year where it doesn't matter what we think the narratives are. So we're kind of in wait and see with that. But ultimately, the players dictate how good the team can be, and he's got the right players in the locker room right now.
Joshua, on that team that won the first ever college football playoff, that it went to 4 games, that was the team. The quarterbacks were all hurt. You guys got hot at the end. Cordell Jones was amazing despite the other injuries. Can you try to take us inside of that locker room of keep chopping wood? And in the end, you ended up winning the Big Ten, dominant the championship game, and won a title.
Yeah, it's one of the more intriguing stories. You got to go back to week 2 of that season. Really, I'll explain this. So my freshman year was Urban's first year. We went 12-0, and then we went 12-0 in the regular season in 2013. So 24 straight games that we won. Then we lose 3 out of 4 games. The Big Ten championship, we lost to Clemson in the Orange Bowl. We win our road opener, our season opener on the road against Navy. And then we come home, we lose to Virginia Tech and got blown out. So that was 24 straight wins, and we lose 3 out of 4. And we just had to figure out how to become a better football team at that point. There was no conversation about, hey, we're still in it to win a title with a 4-team format or we can win our conference. It was just like, we have to be a better team. We have to be better individual football players. And so we just worked and we put our head down and we looked up, and by the end of the year, we were in position to play in a Big Ten championship game. Now, JT got hurt the week before that, Barrett, who had stepped in for Braxton Miller. And so we're going in there with a new quarterback. And we had no idea what the playoff committee was going to have to say about our performance or how much, whatever the case was. We just wanted to win the game. And I don't know if anybody else has ever won a conference championship game by 59 points, but that's what we did. And that was kind of the catalyst for it all. Then we were the 4th seed. We get Alabama, and that was kind of the moment we knew that if we wanted to be who we thought we could be at that point, we were going to have to knock off the dynasty, and we were going to have to beat the greatest coach in the game in Nick Saban, which is what we did then. And then we played Oregon for the title, and by that point, we just knew that we were champions. Like, leading into that game, we knew that was a dub. And so our mentality shifted from how can I just become a better football player today in practice to we've put the work in and we know now what we can be, and that's champions. And it was a long way to get there, but the most rewarding journeys usually take you on a little bit of a trip like that. And so always fun to reminisce. I'm still close with a lot of guys I played with on that team, but it's one of the great stories that I'll remember about sports, obviously, because I was part of it, but you start to think of the trials and tribulations and all of the unknown that comes along with it, and to be able to persevere out of that was awesome.
50-4, is that right? Do I have that right? Your record at Ohio, 50-4.
50-4. It's crazy to think about.
Do you remember the 50, the national title, or do you remember the 4?
Oh no, dude, I remember the 4. It's one of those. Every time it gets you, we only lost to one team, one conference opponent, and that was Michigan State. We lost to them twice. I mentioned the Orange Bowl that we played against Clemson and against Virginia Tech, but it's like Big Ten, nobody could touch us except for the Spartans. We went 500 against them. And this was the D'Antonio years where 2015 they made it to the college football playoff and they had Rose Bowls and everything. So, it was kind of us as the top dogs in the Big Ten at that time. But the four stand out to me, none worse than when we played Michigan State in 15. The last game I ever played in the Horseshoe. We lost on the last-second field goal. I wake up in a cold sweat once a week thinking about that football game.
I bet you do. Is that the team that beat Baylor in the Cotton Bowl? Was that 15?
No, 15 was that was the team that got blown out by Bama, I think, 38-0 in the semis. The year before that was the one that beat Baylor
in that Cotton Bowl, the crazy Cotton Bowl thing. Anything else, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah. Which team do you think is going to have the roughest year this year?
That is a good question. Are we talking Big Ten or nationally or what?
I'll let you do both.
Okay. So in the Big Ten, the one that is interesting to me is USC because I feel like they're all in. But if things start to get a little bit funky early on and maybe they go lose a couple of games, I think that is a team where the wheels could fall off, right? Like it could get very strange for them. The one, and bad year needs context around this, but the one that does intrigue me nationally is the University of Georgia because we have come to expect them to just win SEC championships and be in the national title picture year in and year out. And they've got a lot of change there where they've got a new quarterback that's coming in and their run game wasn't very good a year ago. And they had great players on defense, but also some lapses on that side of the football. And I'm curious to see if they end up rebounding and they're right back in the mix like they always are, or is this kind of like a step back 9-3 type of season for Georgia?
Joshua, thank you very much for your time. The Big Ten Network, great to have you on the show. Enjoy as much of the summer as you can because football season is barreling down the tracks. Joshua, 50-4 as a player at Ohio State in Columbus.